Hi, everyone. Welcome to this new learning series from the Forest Climate Working Group. We're calling them a Latte and Learn. So they're going to be short 45-minute sessions geared more towards policymakers and their support staff and decision makers. So a little less technical than our regular learning exchange series. We're going to be covering a number of topics in the coming year. We don't have them scheduled yet, but you can see the range of topics down here at the bottom of this flyer. So we're going to be doing some deep dives, but today we're going to just start off with Forests and Climate 101. Why are we talking about forests and climate change? This is becoming an increasingly important topic area. And the aim of this series is to provide the scientific foundation to engage in conversations about forests and climate and carbon storage. So today we're going to be talking about the basic science, forest carbon management and adaptation, and future opportunities. I'm Lauren Cooper. I am with the Michigan State University Forest Carbon and Climate Program, and I'll be giving the quick science background. We have Chris Swanston from NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, who will give us an overview of risks and climate adaptation. And then Kathy McDonald from TNC, the Nature Conservancy, is the Director for Natural Climate Solutions for North America, and we'll be talking about opportunities. And then we'll have a short discussion, a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Ann Bartuska of Resources for the Future, RFF. And I encourage you to please put in questions at any point throughout the session in the Q&A or the chat, and Anne will be bringing those to the speakers at the end. I want to use this graphic, this figure here, to orient us to the entire series. We're going to keep coming back to this image, but it is carbon in time and space. And the takeaway here is that carbon and forests, they operate on a landscape. And so people that are not depends on what scale you're working in forestry as well, but a lot of times some of our more localized topics or issues that we're having need to be taken in context at a large scale, particularly if we're talking about the United States or one of the US states. What's happening at a regional scale, it gets really important for carbon storage. And so this is this idea that we have forest stand dynamics that are happening, those scale up to being overall landscape level impacts. And so we're gonna recall those bullets I had before of these deep dive topics. We're gonna be using this graphic to kind of zone into specific components and have future sessions that are breaking down the science of what's happening in each of these specific areas. So to kind of get going on my talk here, I'm going to give a quick science background. This is a image that is familiar, but we always can kind of get a quick review on the greenhouse effect. And so might be a while since you've learned about this, but the main idea here is that the Earth has a blanket around it, which is the atmosphere, that makes it a nice place for us to live. If we didn't have this, all the solar energy that hits the Earth would bounce right back off. It wouldn't stay around the planet for very long. But because of the atmosphere and the greenhouse gases, when energy comes in from the sun, it is trapped here for a bit. And that makes so the climate regulation, temperature, this is all because of this greenhouse effect. The issue is that we are changing the strength of the greenhouse effect through emitting greenhouse gases, through carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that you've heard about, like methane. But we're going to talk about strictly CO2 today. It is really the most important currently in terms of affecting climate change. And it also has really important implications for land management, which some of the other greenhouse gases don't have as much. And it's something we can interact with more directly. So water vapor is another gas with a warming effect, but it's pretty hard to control water vapor. So we're focusing on carbon. And so here's recent trends in CO2 and temperature. This might be familiar, but it just shows a very tight correlation between CO2 and global warming. So we can see that these are, this is deviation from the mean. So it's showing that over time, if you averaged all the years of the last 100 years, the first 50 of them were below what that average is, and then the later years, as you can see, are above that average. So this shows a clear trend over time. And this also is really important because we hear that people will say, oh, well, the atmosphere, the climate's always been changing. And this is true. But what we're seeing here is something that has taken millennia to happen in the past. And when it did happen, we had big changes on how the earth functioned and felt to live on. So we've had deep freezes, we've had warmer periods. So it has changed. That doesn't mean that what's happening here is normal, or that it's not going to be without impact. And it's important to point the trajectory here is very concerning, because what is another 100 years going to be when we have increasing population, increasing fossil fuel use? We are already in a troubling spot, and another additional 100 years could be even more dramatic. I like to share this figure. This shows this kind of the same idea. So we see this upward trend of emissions coming from, here we have fossil fuels in industry, and then also land use change. So when we lose forests, it actually causes emissions. And so this is kind of, again, the sources and then sinks. So here we have sources on the top. And what happens is that these are actually mirrored underneath, because when we have emissions, they don't go into outer space. Unfortunately, they do stay by the earth and in the atmosphere, and so they're being absorbed either, which we see down here, into the ocean, into the atmosphere, or the land sink. And this is why land use and the land sink is really fascinating, because this can be either a source of carbon and a source of greenhouse gases, or it can be a sink and actually can absorb and store those greenhouse gases. So this is a really interesting area to be focusing on, and have a lot of implications for decision making. Here's another way to look at this. These are all the fluxes, the major fluxes that are happening. So we have over here, the land sector, that's functioning land sector, is currently storing more carbon than it emits. But we do emit carbon through respiration and wildfire and other major disturbances. But this is the land sector. On the other side, we have oceans, which have currently are absorbing more carbon than they emit. But it's important to note that this isn't without impacts. So what we're seeing is ocean acidification. So this is that even though the ocean's doing a nice job in absorbing some of this greenhouse gas for us, some of the carbon, it does have ramifications for ocean health, which is a separate topic. And then here's again our sources. So we have land use change when we lose forests, when we lose wetlands, they're going to have emissions losses or emissions. And then when we burn fossil fuels, this is just a net source of emissions up into the atmosphere. And I also thought it might be nice to quickly review carbon processes and photosynthesis. So what we have here, this to kind of move us from this idea of gases to solids, just a quick reminder of photosynthesis, or maybe you haven't learned this before, but basically you can see CO2, which is carbon dioxide, it interacts with water, and through photosynthesis in the leaves, it forms sugars. So this is a fancy looking element here, but it is our molecule here, but it is sugar, carbohydrates. And so the trees then use that for energy and to fuel their processes, but that also goes into their physical structure. So they actually take the carbon and build it into their cellular material. And so what happens is trees are actually about 50% carbon once that's dried wood. So there's some water weight there. But if you have a log that you're about to throw on a fire and you weight it, about half of that weight is actually carbon. So it seems like we're talking about something abstract, but we're talking about something actually pretty physical. And then that carbon is stored in, just if you can imagine a forest, which I'll go into the next slide here, that carbon is then stored in the trees. It's stored in living material. Once sticks and leaves break off, or a tree dies, that becomes dead material, but it's still storing carbon. It's slowly breaking down. That carbon makes its way onto forest floors. It goes into the soil. So soil is a really rich pool of carbon in many forests, and some it's extremely rich. So this is how carbon kind of trickles into the system. And so finally, I'm going to share a slide that moves us into climate change and carbon storage, and go over these 3 mitigation strategies that we're starting to see become really prevalent here. The first is increasing or maintaining forest land. So this is by reforestation or avoiding deforestation. The second is maintaining or increasing carbon stocks. So this could be ensuring your forests stay healthy, adapting to climate change, maybe increasing stocking in some areas that are degraded. And then 3 is increasing sustainable wood use. And that could be substituting for sustainable wood in building materials or possibly even energy. But generally replacing more energy intensive materials with sustainable natural resources. And so with that, I will hand it over to Chris. Thank you so much.
Competitive relationships between those species change. And so it's not just, like I said, that the whole forest will change, but the way that the species interact with each other and the environment begins to change. And then the forest then begins to change. Now, this can take years, decades, even centuries, because forests have a lot of inertia. It's actually kind of hard to change them just by even a rapid change in climate. But we also have this issue of shifting stressors. So these are more discrete events. And like this one that you see in the picture, about 10 years ago in Wisconsin, 200,000 acres of forest blew down overnight. So these discrete events can be real game changers in forests. So if you take one thing away from this talk, it would be that climate change is a threat multiplier. Oftentimes you'll hear from forest managers, this isn't much different than what I've been doing for years. You know, we've always had fire, we've always had pests, we've always had these windstorms. The thing is that they're all worse now. Generally, this isn't always true, but I'm just gonna say generally, if you have a threat to your forest productivity or your forest health, climate change is gonna make that threat worse. So there's the chronic stress that I was mentioning earlier of just a gradual change in climate, changing competitive relationships, making the habitat just a little bit more unsuitable or a little less suitable so that the species might not grow as well as it did. There's these discrete disturbances, which can be micro droughts, ice storms, wind storms. These things can make the species and the forest as a whole less resilient, a little bit more stressed, so that insect pests and diseases can come in and have more damage. Now, the pests themselves, their ranges are increasing in general, and they often can have more than one life cycle, or more life cycles than they previously had in a given growing season. So they are having more effect than they used to. Likewise, invasive species, they compete with the species that we generally value in forests, which are often the more mature species. And so those species, again, that competitive relationship becomes a disadvantageous relationship to the species we care about when the forest that we value and the species in it we value aren't doing as well because they're stressed. The invasive species generally do better with disturbance, so they become more competitive. Now, wildfire is, of course, could just fit in the disturbances, but as we've seen, it's become a thing in and unto itself. So the more stressed the system becomes, the more mortality, death there is in the system. And then with climate change, the drier the air gets. I would love to talk to you all about vapor pressure deficit, but wasn't given nearly enough time, and I probably just wouldn't do that to you. But anyway, the drier the air gets, the more likely we are to have fire starts, and the more likely those starts are to actually catch and become a fire, and then the more likely that fire is to become very severe, and that's what we're seeing. Sea level rise. All along our coast, thousands and thousands of miles, is not just about the inexorable inch by inch rise of seas, it's about the big storm surge, which makes its way inland. And the forest, which ironically, although being near the coast, can't handle a bunch of seawater flooding up into them, even if it's just for several hours, that can actually damage the health of the forest. So any one of these things can be damaging, but they all tend to work together to become this major influence on changing the inertia of forests. And again, throw climate change into the mix, and it's this threat multiplier. All right, so when we are managing these forests, we generally have what we call a desired future condition of the forest that we manage for. That is often what it is now. We want the forest to persist the way it is, or maybe a better version of the way it is. Now, the thing is that the further that climate changes from where the forest evolved in climate from where it is now, the more resources it will take us to maintain the forest as it is, and the higher the risk becomes of that system failing, or our values, what we value in that system, failing. So as we think about how to adapt to that pressure, to that change, adaptation is not throwing out everything we've learned in the past 150 years about sustainable management and conservation and restoration. It's about using that information, again, to protect what we value in these forests. One thing that I'll say about what we value is that every time you have a conversation about climate adaptation, you are talking about your values and your risk tolerance. And so are the people who you're discussing it with. Even if none of that is explicit, it will always be there in the discussion. So as we talk about managing risk, if we have a desired future condition to maintain that ecosystem as it is, we may be willing to invest the resources to do that. We may be willing to tolerate more risk in order to maintain that system the way it is, because it's what we value. If, on the other hand, we don't value the system the way it is as much as we value something it provides, like just cover on soil because we want clean water out of the watershed, we may be more willing to release that system as it is, as long as we have a healthy forest growing there. So slightly different values and slightly different risk tolerance, both near-term and long-term in that case. So we talk about these ideas of resistance and resilience. These are about persistence. These are about keeping the system generally the way it is into the future because we value the system the way it is. Whereas transition is whether we don't think the system can be maintained, or we aren't willing to incur the risk of maintaining that system, or we really actually want another system. This is often the case, in fact, in restoration, from an existing low value system into something that was there, that we highly value, that was there in the past perhaps, and can do better in the future in climate change. There's a brain teaser for you. We may be willing to transition the system to something different, take on some short-term risk for longer-term lower risk. All right, so some concluding thoughts. Again, take this away, take this with you. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It just makes a lot of things worse. It can provide some opportunities, but we have to be willing to invest in chasing down those opportunities. That's adaptation. Adaptation takes effort, it incurs some risk, but ideally, if you do it in an informed manner, it can reduce your risk. And again, if you successfully reduce your risk, you are ideally increasing or maintaining your carbon sink. And as you're trying to get all this done, I would encourage folks to be very clear about what you value and what your goals with those values are, because that's how other people are going to be hearing you. All right, that's it for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, thank you. My name is Catherine McDonald. I'm the Natural Climate Solutions Director for the Nature Conservancy, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I get to talk about the opportunities that we have to use the land sector, going back to what Lauren introduced, to put photosynthesis to work for us to address climate change. And so as she described, natural climate solutions, as we like to call them at the Nature Conservancy, are actions that conserve, restore carbon, conserve carbon on the landscape, restore carbon, and improved land management strategies that help remove carbon from the air, while providing a lot of other benefits for us. And why are they important? It's critical that we improve and increase land sector carbon storage in order to get to net zero by 2050. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it very clear that we have to reach net zero by no later than 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so it's important that we think about the land sector and think about ways that we can increase sequestration in the land sector, in part by addressing some of the things that Chris described, being intentional about how we think about adaptation and management of the landscape. The land sector, as shown here in EPA's 2020 report, currently reduces overall emissions in the United States by about 11%. So you see it below the zero, reducing the total overall emissions. One of my colleagues did a study to look at how much more we could store on the landscape with intentional management. And he, along with a number of other researchers, evaluated about 21 different management practices that could be taken in our forests, our agricultural lands, and our wetlands to increase carbon sequestration. And as shown here, there's a lot going on this slide, but as shown here, the total length of the bar represents the total potential that we could get per year from that management strategy. The different colors represent the cost of doing that. So the lightest colors are the least costs, the amount of that total potential that you can have happen for less than $10, around $10 per ton. The medium colored green is $50 a ton. The next darkest is $100 a ton. And those values were selected because the current carbon prices are about $10 to $15 a ton. The social cost of carbon around $50 a ton. And people estimate that in order to achieve the outcomes for the in the Paris Agreement, that we might need to spend up to $100 a ton. And so that's what you can see in the green bars. If you look to the left of the y-axis, you can see little bars that show the kinds of co-benefits that we find with these different management practices. And there are all sorts of incredible co-benefits when we manage lands intentionally to produce carbon benefits. We also get a host of other benefits. The greatest potential is in our forests, and currently our forests are providing the bulk of the offsetting or reduction in total emissions that are seen in the US. So we talk about the benefits for air quality, water quality, wildlife habitat, and productivity of our soils. But there are other co-benefits. When we plant trees in our urban areas, we can greatly improve health through improved air quality, reduced heat islands. When we invest in practices that improve soil health, we get increased farm and forest productivity. And when we do that, we can provide increased income to landowners, forest and farm landowners. So there are a whole host of benefits that have been borne out in research, follow-on research that's been done by a number of different scientists and organizations and agencies. So lots of important co-benefits that we can get by intentionally managing land to help us meet the climate crisis. There are opportunities across all ownership types. This is specific to the forest ownership types and shows in different colors the different types of ownerships. I want to just bring your attention to the green, which are our forests that are owned by families and individuals in the US. They own and manage about 38% of the forest in the US. So one of the biggest percentages of our forests. Another important point is we have lots of opportunities to increase carbon sequestration on public lands. We also have significant opportunities on tribal lands, state lands, and the corporate forest companies. So lots of opportunities across all of these different ownership types, and the kinds of things that we need to think about doing vary based on those ownership types. There are a number of different types of policy solutions that we can think about in order to help us increase sequestration in the land sector. One is simply setting a goal. Just like we set goals for other sectors, setting a goal for the land sector and then investing in achieving that goal is a critical policy effort with the potential of re-entering the Paris Agreement. We have the opportunity to update our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, and we have the opportunity to be very intentional about what we set for the land sector, so it can be an important part of a comprehensive strategy for reducing emissions in the United States. Second, a really important area is improving land sector emissions inventories. The kinds of remote sensing, LiDAR, the Forest Services Forest Inventory and Assessment Program, the Natural Resource Conservation Services, Natural Resource Inventory, opportunities to enhance those inventories so that we can better track our progress towards the goals we set, but also to help us reduce transaction costs for entering into voluntary carbon markets and compliance carbon markets. So another really important reason for us to invest more in understanding the land sector and the opportunities for sequestration in that. Certainly public land management policies are an important area to think about, as well as budgets and how we can increase sequestration in public lands. Opportunities for providing incentives to encourage private landowners and managers to implement practices that are helpful. Programs through the Farm Bill, for example, are really important opportunities for us to incentivize increased sequestration in the land sector. There are also opportunities for the federal government to incentivize improved state laws to protect carbon. So that's another area of opportunity, and then important opportunities to de-risk private investment in natural climate solutions. There are a growing number of companies that are very interested in helping them go farther and meeting their sustainability goals, in addition to reducing their own process footprint. A number of companies are very interested in investing in natural climate solutions. And one of the important considerations is how much risk there is in those investments. And so the federal government can play an important role there, as well as a state government. And just close with 5 principles that we think should be built into any policy approaches for natural climate solutions. We hope that they will be designed to have net gain for both biodiversity and people. There are ways of managing the land to increase carbon that could have negative effects on biodiversity. For example, growing trees in native grassland habitats that are important for grassland birds. So it's an important consideration in design. Certainly we need to look for opportunities to enhance and advance environmental justice and think about how to implement these practices in an equitable way. They should always be driven by the best available science and innovation. They should be designed to be credible and accountable. And then they need to really be propelled by transformative investments in ambitious programs. If we are going to see the potential that my colleagues found in the land sector, we really need to change how we manage lands in the hundreds of millions of acres across the US. So really important for us to look for ways to enhance and expand our ability to transform how we manage lands to benefit climate. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. All the speakers did a great job setting up, I think, a lot of good information, and we have a few questions that have come in. I'm encouraging those who are on the line to put your questions in the chat box. Part of the advantage is we'll have it as a record, so we can do follow-up later on. I'm Ann Bartuska from Resources for the Future. I'm really glad to be with all of you this morning. So let me launch into my first question. And this might be for Chris, but others should feel free to dive into it. We know that habitats are changing with climate and that there are potential for different forest scenarios in the future. So how should we be thinking about planting species and the whole notion of reforestation, looking at future trends of climate and what new conditions that are not historical?
Thanks, Ann, and thanks for the question. As we look into the future, what we urge is that people consider a range of plausible future climates. It's tempting, especially if you're an engineer, to look at the worst possible climate, hottest, biggest change, and build your bridge for that. That might make sense and cost benefit and risk analysis for an engineer. If you are managing an ecosystem, you don't want to just wholesale change the whole ecosystem. If most people don't, if you're a conservationist, you're wanting to manage that system for the greatest health you can within the existing range of the system. So you want to look at that range of plausible futures and what those climate futures how those climate futures might affect that ecosystem. And then as you're planting, you might want to adjust the native species that you're planting already to maybe emphasize species that will be better adapted across a wider range of those plausible future climates, as opposed to just one edge of the range on the outside, or just the climate as it was 75 years ago. So we very much encourage people to look forward, not just at historic range of variability, but at a future range of variability, and plan for that, and plan for the whole range, not putting all your eggs into one basket of just part of the range.
Great. Kathy or Lauren, do you want to add anything?
I think you summed it up well, yeah.
Kathy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think Chris did a great job of explaining it, really just thinking about the future conditions and trying to consider the species that are going to be best adapted to that.
So one of the questions that came in from Mackenzie Skirka was regarding forest resiliency and how we can think about that as we look into the future. It seems like that might be a bit of a corollary on the previous question. So could somebody approach that or respond to that, and maybe thinking it in terms of forest management in the long run and what we have to be thinking about in terms of promoting resiliency?
I can jump in with a couple comments here. I think this is a good point to highlight the need for continued research in this space. So with changing conditions, we have gotten to a point where we can't just rely on what was previous information or like long-standing best practices or norms. And we have to become more flexible and support bringing in new information, rely on our networks to get that information out to actors and decision makers, and to be really active when we're working with various natural resource professionals and landowners. So when we have to actively be researching, creating new information, whether it's through field research or pilot plots, and be really active with this knowledge transfer in this space, which has been a longstanding kind of tradition in natural resources, but climate change has just really made this even more important, and really a need to keep learning from one another and getting that information out.
Actually, I want to ask Kathy a question. You talk about the FIA and NRI and some very important resources that we have available. There's a constant tension, though, between the scale of measurement, whether it's plot or landscape, and then there's also this tension between plot-based and remote sensing. And is it an either or is there another way we should be looking at that?
I think it's an and. I think we need plot-based sampling as well as remote sensing. We can get the farthest by using that combination. And to the point that Lauren was just making, we need information at all scales, and we need to be doing research going forward to really understand how our forests are changing and how we can interact with them for the best results. For all the different kinds of co-benefits that we get from forests.
I was looking at my time, maybe we have time for one more big question, and it's really to everyone, so I'll ask you all to dive in on this one. Chris actually mentioned other values and thinking about the forest. As we look into the future and think about how we respond to climate challenge, and we're focusing on carbon, there clearly are other values that are part of forest estate. So comment on how we should be looking at the balance between the carbon sequestration, carbon management versus other priorities for forests, and whether they be working forests or preserved forests. So if we could take that one on, and that it's a question of balance. And I'll just go ahead maybe through my screen, starting with Chris, then to Lauren, and with Kathy in the end.
Thanks, Anne. In some ways, we already struggle with that balance. And so now we're just adding another management objective that we might not have thought much about in the past, which is carbon management, carbon sequestration to the balance. But we already try to balance recreational values with water quality and quantity watershed values, aesthetics, cultural values, wildlife, habitat. So already we have these multiple uses across the landscapes and across land ownerships. And so looking into the future, now we add carbon, and we will need to continue to try to balance how we can best manage at a landscape level and in different ownerships in which different values have primacy and are the telling factor.
Great, thank you. Lauren.
Yeah, Chris just touched on the response I always have here is this idea of a landscape approach. So, we don't want to suggest that carbon would become the most dominant value for any forest, because we have all sorts of rich reasons why we value forests, for habitat, for water quality. And so when you look across a landscape, you can have those diverse values and maybe have in some areas priorities. And so you could have production as a priority for this area, and you could have long-term old growth carbon storage as a priority on the same landscape. So we don't want to be suggesting any sort of like conversion of forests to more productive purposes at the loss of biodiversity for the sake of carbon. So we have to really think about the full impacts of climate. Carbon is just one extra piece of information, but getting back to the resiliency questions, we're going to have to continue to keep all of those values for forests in mind. But it is really interesting to think about how we could use some extra information about where carbon is stored in our landscapes to maybe inform those decisions going forward.
Thank you. And Kathy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Chris and Lauren summed it up well. Maybe I'll just add a little different dimension. And that's, kind of how, when we talk to landowners, value all sorts of things about the forests they own and manage for, hope to manage for those, all the things that they value. A lot of it is about the next generation. A lot of it is about the co-benefits that they get, but there's also an important economic return that landowners need from their working forests. So as I think Lauren was saying, trying to take that landscape view when we think about across all the different ownerships, but also thinking about, what the forests mean to the people that own and manage them, and trying to find ways to best help them achieve their goals and hopefully societal goals for addressing climate, as well as maintaining biodiversity, creating clean water, and improving our air. And natural climate solutions are something that we can do on lands, whether it's urban or rural, and no matter what ownerships we have. So we have lots of opportunities to think about how to best work with the wide range of forests to provide the goods and services that we enjoy.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks to all of our speakers and the participants who are on the line. We really appreciate you joining us today. Hopefully this just whets your appetite for some deeper dives on particular subjects. Lauren started with a list of a few that we have planned coming up, including reforestation, but there may be some other things that are emerging as you're dealing with legislation and other kinds of issues that we would like us to think about. So feel free to provide that input to Lauren Cooper and her FCCP group. You do have additional resources going to the Forest Climate Working Group site, the FCCP Forest Carbon and Climate Program site. We've already mentioned the Forest Services Office of Climate and Sustainability, and then of course my organization, Resources for the Future. So hopefully all of that information is available to you, and we're willing to help and help you walk through some of these other topics. So take care, and we'll be back in, I believe, January. It would be the next one. And have a great holiday, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.